Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. Today, we start a new unit on metaphysics that is about existence. And I thought that it'd be a nice way to introduce this section by getting us to think about the nature of reality, but also in the sense of motivating the idea about the extent to which what we take to be real has also moral implications. And one neat way to start thinking about this, I think, is through the ethics of virtual reality. And in particular, in this particular case, even video games. But of course, in our time, it's increasingly being applicable to VR. Okay, so let's kind of talk about the so-called gamer's dilemma. So the main thesis of this article, or really of this lecture, is that our moral attitudes toward virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are inconsistent. And why is that? Because most of us seem to think the virtual murder is completely fine. Many of us have been played games, right? And in playing games, you have killed other either NPCs or other players, right? And it seems like it's so ubiquitous that we don't think twice about it, right? It's just a game, right? You would probably say, and not inconsistently say, yeah, when I shoot all those people on Call of Duty or on Halo or whatever, I'm not actually killing anybody. It's because I'm not actually harming anyone, right? Those are just NPCs. They're just virtual. But if that's the case, then it would seem that there's nothing also wrong with virtual pedophilia, right? Because one would argue there are no actual children being harmed. Those are just NPCs, right? It's just virtual. But that would seem, right, and I think a lot of us would feel that seems suspect, right? That seems counterintuitive. It seems like even virtual pedophilia seems wrong. And so the question is why? Why would murder, virtual murder, be fine, but not virtual pedophilia, right? And so that's the thesis of this article, which is that our moral attitudes towards virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are inconsistent. So here's the main argument, like to look at it in the more broader sense for us to understand the paper. Premise one is if virtual murder, that is killing in games, is morally permissible, then virtual pedophilia, that is sexual acts with virtual children, should also be morally permissible. Right? And that's what we just talked about, right? If the reasons why virtual murder is that you're not dealing with actual people and you're not actually harming anyone, then that would seem to suggest that there's nothing actually wrong with virtual pedophilia. But most people believe virtual murder is permissible, right? A lot of you guys probably play games every day in which you're virtually murdering other players or NPCs. But virtual pedophilia is not. Again, this is where the inconsistency from premise one and premise two seems to come into being. Premise three, to maintain both beliefs consistently, there must be a moral difference between the two acts, right? So if we want to accept virtual murder as being fine, but not virtual pedophilia, then there must be a way to distinguish them. Like, what is it about virtual pedophilia that makes it wrong, that seems to be fine, which seems to be absent in virtual murder? Okay? Now, what this article is going to argue is that at least so far, there are no good arguments, and we're going to go over several arguments. There are no good arguments from social norms, or the likelihood of harm, or virtue ethics, and again, we'll talk about all these, which successfully establish such a difference. Okay, so again, remember, we in prima facie, or it seems like we want to say from a common sense perspective, or just from an intuitive perspective, the virtual murder is fine, but virtual pedophilia it's not fine. And so the challenge of this article is to say, okay, why? What is the difference between these two, such that virtual pedophilia is wrong, but virtual murder is fine? And this article goes through several arguments to try to make that distinction, and they say they fail. Because they fail, that's why we can draw the conclusion, or the author draws the conclusion, that it just seems like our moral attitudes toward virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are inconsistent, because we don't have, again, according to this author, any way in which to distinguish these two acts, if that makes sense. All right, so let's start. So most of this paper is really devoted to establishing premise 4. So we're going to go through several arguments that might seem like get us the answer we want, and we'll consider its shortcomings. So the first argument is the social acceptability. So on this view, virtual murder is socially acceptable, but virtual pedophilia is not. Okay? And if what society accepts is morally right, then social acceptability determines morality. Therefore, virtual murder is morally permissible, and virtual pedophilia is not. So this is the first argument that he considers for why virtual murder is fine, but virtual pedophilia is not. And it is that it seems like we find it acceptable that virtual murder is fine, right? But not virtual pedophilia. And that's why that's ultimately what determines the ethics. Now, if you probably remember from our lecture on ethical subjectivism, this is a version of ethical subjectivism. And just like our problems with that in that lecture, they also arise here, right? That namely, that social acceptability is not a good guide to our ethics, right? There was a time when slavery was socially acceptable, and just because it was socially acceptable did not make it right. Likewise, the fact that virtual murder is socially acceptable maybe doesn't make it actually fine, right? Maybe it's a bad thing that we have made it socially acceptable to engage in virtual murder. Maybe you haven't thought about this before. In the past, when I've taught this, I find that students actually, some of them, not all of them, are actually kind of inclined or find that thought somewhat appealing. Like, hey, maybe we should rethink this aspect of our society. Now, what I have also found is that people who actually are more likely to play gamers are not inclined to find this at all. But it's always interesting to think about this. All right. So that's argument 1, and these are the reasons why. So the main reason why this is not a good argument then is because social acceptability is just not a good way to ground our moral judgments. All right. Argument number 2, what we can call the likelihood of real world harm. So we can say, okay, premise 1, acts that significantly increase the likelihood of real harm are morally wrong. So this is a consequentialist argument, right? If an action is likely to cause bad consequences, then that makes that action bad. Number 2, virtual pedophilia significantly increases the likelihood of real abuse, while virtual murder does not increase the likelihood of real murder. Right? So this is the main premise, right? So this is saying the reason why virtual pedophilia is wrong, but not virtual murder, is because of the consequence of allowing virtual pedophilia, namely that it increases the likelihood of real abuse, while virtual murder does not increase the likelihood of real murder. Therefore, virtual pedophilia is wrong and virtual murder is not. Well, the main problem with this argument, as Luck kind of develops it, is that this relies on just substantial empirical evidence that's just not clear. Like, it's just not, and it goes across several. there are different issues here. For this argument to be powerful and be the reason, a lot of things have to happen. First, as a matter of fact, it has to be the case that virtual pedophilia actually increases the likelihood of real abuse. And that's not at all obvious. I think Neil Levy wrote about this, and he said that actually that you need to actually do work on this, although it's hard because nobody really wants to. This is hard to test in actuality because it involves actual ethics. But it's possible. Neil Levy argues that actually virtual pedophilia might actually help individuals with these dangerous desires to not actually commit real pedophilia, right? That's very likely. There are similar kinds of techniques that are used in other cases. And so if that's the case, then that aspect is false. The other relevant piece of information here is that perhaps virtual murder does not increases. Sorry, it's also an open empirical question, maybe. Although actually, Morgan does say that actually there is a lot of empirical evidence which kind of suggests that violent video games or virtual murder does increase the likelihood of violence. Maybe, but here's the main problem with that. And this is the problem with this argument in general, is that relying on empirical studies is hard to determine the actual causal relations as opposed to correlations, right? Because sure, there's studies that have found that it is highly correlated, that individuals who play violent video games can be more violent. But the problem with that is that we don't know what's actually the cause or the effect. Is it that violent video games actually cause people to be more violent? Or is it that violent people who already have a disposition to be violent, are more likely to play video games, violent video games, right? In which case, it's not the video game's fault, right? And I think a lot of us, especially if you have played violent video games, just anecdotally, this is no like significance, but anecdotally, as somebody who played a lot of games growing up as a teenager, up until college, with my siblings and friends, it's very hard anecdotally to say that we were that increased our disposition to violence, right? That seems hard to make, again, anecdotally. But the main point then is that this argument relies too heavily on empirical evidence that we just don't have, and we can't have, right? Because we can't test a group of subjects who watch pedophilia and then test whether they actually engage in real pedophilia. Like, that's just not possible. Or same with using randomized control trials. Like, we can't do that, right? So this argument, according to Luck, is ultimately pretty weak. All right, argument 3, and this is kind of gets interesting. What's the difference between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia? Well, according to this argument, virtual pedophilia harms the person themselves rather than virtual murder. Here's how the way the argument goes. Premise 1. Actions that cultivate vicious desires or corrupt one's character are morally wrong. So virtual pedophilia seems to suggest that it cultivates desires for real pedophilia and it corrupts the person's character. Right, so that's the first part of this. So enjoying virtual pedophilia fosters vicious desires, but enjoying virtual murder does not, right? It maybe satisfies a drive to be competitive instead, right? Therefore, virtual pedophilia is wrong, while virtual murder may be permissible. The problem with this is that it's just not clear that you can make this distinction. And here's a few ways that we can think about this. First, it's not actually clear that somebody who engages in virtual murder, like playing video games like about killing other people, that they're not actually enjoying the virtual murder, right? Um, and again, maybe for example, some of you guys who are gamers are really, you guys are in pole position to understand this, right? Like I remember, like even when I was young, there was this game, and I'm sure there's iterations of this game now, Mortal Kombat, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with Mortal Kombat, but a lot of the game hinges on just really brutal killings that, quite frankly, that's what gamers enjoy. It's the brutality and the grotesqueness of it. Um, and same with, I'm sure there are countless games. Probably one of the main ones too, and is this game called Grand Theft Auto. Again, I played it when I was young. I don't know if there's been iterations of this game. Maybe it's too old of a game for some of you. But Grand Theft Auto was a game in which you kind of did a lot of illegal activity, one of which was driving around, kind of killing civilians. That was the thing that it was known about the game because almost everybody did it. Like I did it, my siblings did it, my friends did it. We thought it was fun to actually go around killing civilians. Well, virtual civilians, because it was NPCs, right? And so it's so the main things that this in a way purifies virtual murder too much, right? And so this itself cannot be what distinguishes these different it cannot distinguish, or it cannot tell us what is morally distinct about virtual murder versus virtual pedophilia. All right, argument number 4 is interesting, and it's called unfairly targeting a group objection. Oh, actually, my apologies. I want to say one more thing, which Morgan raises about this argument. And so the first one is that it's not actually clear that that people don't play video games or engage in virtual murder because they enjoy it. It seems like people do. So that's one way in which this argument doesn't work. The other interesting one is that what if somebody created a game in which you had to, like, and this is the example he gave, like seduce like a 15-year-old or something like that, just in order to pass the game. So some you can imagine someone playing this game and all they care about is to finish the game. They're like really into finishing the games, right? And so they do the quick, whatever seduction about the 15-year-old or whatever, and they go on to continue to play the game to finish it. Now in that case, the gamer is only engaging in virtual pedophilia because they're trying to accomplish the game, right? That's the goal. It's not because they're enjoying it or anything like that. Maybe they even hate it. But if that's the case, then that would be an example in which this argument say, oh, that kind of virtual pedophilia is fine as long as you don't enjoy it. But I think most of us would say, no, that's still problematic, right? Like a developer should not create such a game, right? And so that's why this idea about that what makes it wrong is that it gives rise to particular desires cannot be why virtual pedophilia is wrong, but virtual murder is fine. Okay, let's move on now to argument number 4. This is the unfairly targeting a group argument. And it goes like this: acts that unfairly single out or demean a particular group of people are morally wrong. Okay? So, for example, if there was a game that involved virtual murder, but you only were killing a particular group of people, like let's say you were only killing Jewish people, or you're only killing black people, or only white people, or only homosexuals, or only of any particular group of people, if that's what the game was about, then we would find it problematic, right? And so maybe that's what's wrong with virtual pedophilia, that it's not wrong in virtual murder, period. It's that it's targeting a specific group of people for harm, namely children. So that's the way we would be able to distinguish a game like Grand Theft Auto 4, which indiscriminately you can virtually kill all types of people, as opposed to virtual pedophilia, because virtual pedophilia involves targeting a specific group, namely children. So premise one, like I said, would be that acts that unfairly single or demean a particular group of people are morally wrong. Premise two is that virtual pedophilia unfairly singles out and sexualizes children, a vulnerable protected group. Premise three is that virtual murder, by contrast, typically targets generic characters, like I said, often adult enemies or competitors, not a historically oppressed or vulnerable group. Therefore, virtual pedophilia is wrong, while virtual murder may not be. Okay. Yes, so this is the argument. Now, Luck raises several objections to this. The main one, though, is this really what's wrong with with uh, virtual pedophilia? Because it doesn't seem like it is. Suppose that you could molest, I mean, in a video game, not only children, but you can suppose you can molest all kinds of individuals. So that now you're being inclusive, as it were. Now you're being inclusive about all types of individuals. Would then suddenly make it fine? It seems like that wouldn't be the case, right? Um, and so that is the main reason, I think, why this argument does not seem to work. All right, let's talk about argument 5, which is a special status of children. So premise 1 is children possess a special moral status because of their innocence and defenselessness. Harming a child is ceteris paribus. That word, ceteris paribus, just means all things being equal, worse than harming an adult. So all things being equal, it seems like it is worse to harm a child than an adult. And there are kind of reasons for that. It's because, again, because of their innocence, defenselessness, but even there's this idea in philosophy also about that a child. So if you even if you're not talking about harming, like suppose that you are allocating resources and you can only save either an adult or a child. Like if you're allocating medical resources, it seems more people are inclined to say that you have to save the child than the adult. And part of the reason is it's almost like an issue of fairness. It just seems like the child hasn't had a chance to live as much as the adult, and so they deserve a chance to get to experience teenagehood and so on, and early adulthood, and so on and so forth. And so there is this strong intuition that children have like special obligations that adults don't, or special claims, I should say, that adults lack. There's also the issue of innocence and defenselessness, but there again, there's other broader issues. Okay, so children possess a special moral status because of their innocence and defenselessness. So harming a child is, all things being equal, worse than harming an adult. Premise 2 is virtual pedophilia involves harming children in simulation, while most virtual murders do not involve children. Therefore, virtual pedophilia is morally worse than virtual murder. Now, the main issue with this argument, and there are, again, several, I'll raise two. The first one is that it just doesn't seem to get the issue exactly right. Because this assumes, this assumes that virtual pedophilia is worse than virtual murder. In the following sense, like, okay, abstract from, because it involves children, right? Or depiction of children. Well, let's abstract from the virtual and just go into real life. Is it actually obvious that molestation is worse than murder? That the molestation of a child, as horrible as that is as worse it's worse than murdering an adult? It's not actually clear that that's the case, right? And so if it doesn't work in the real world, why will it work in the virtual world? But perhaps I think more clearly, the main problem with this argument is that sure, it gets us the answer, even if you assume that that's the case, that somehow molestation is worse than murder, it leaves us with this still really counterintuitive conclusion. Because sure, you can claim the virtual pedophilia is worse than virtual murder, but not that much worse. Or to put it another way, it just doesn't seem like virtual murder is almost as bad as virtual pedophilia. It seems like they're completely different moral categories, that perhaps, or at least that's the idea, right? Like, I don't think the solution to this dilemma is just to get the answer. The virtual pedophilia is just a little bit worse than virtual murder. No, we want an account that tells us that virtual pedophilia is really bad, but virtual murder is actually fine or almost not bad at all, because that's intuitive what we want, and this argument does not get us that. All right, argument number 6 is this active versus passive participation. So it goes like this: actively performing an immoral act, even virtually, is worse than passively observing it. Okay? Playing a game involves active participation, while watching a film involves passive observation. Therefore, performing virtual pedophilia in a game is worse than merely viewing such content in a movie. Okay, sorry, I'm bad. Okay, so this is an argument which kind of explains why virtual pedophilia might be different from viewing such content in a movie. Now, whether this is true or not, I actually think that, and this is the last section of the paper, I think this raises just a different issue altogether. So I don't really want to belabor this point, so the only reason why I bring this up is because this argument, which Luck raises, gave rise to one of the main answers to the gamer's dilemma that was developed by somebody else. So I only raised this because Luck talks about it. It talks about this distinction between watching content and playing games. But I only raise it just to acknowledge it, but to really move to this argument, which is Barthel's argument for a moral distinction. And that's this argument. Virtual child molestation constitutes a form of child pornography because it involves a sexual depiction of children, even if the representation is digital. All forms of child pornography are morally wrong. Therefore, virtual child molestation is morally wrong. So what's interesting about this is that why is virtual pedophilia wrong? Not because it's actually an instance of pedophilia. It's not. It's because it's a form of child pornography. It's a form of content. So what makes virtual pedophilia on this view is not like the let's say the gamer is kind of pressing buttons and engaging in virtual pedophilia, is actually that by doing that, the content that is being shown, it's actually child pornography, and child pornography is wrong. So let me put it like this again to compare with the virtual murder. So virtual pedophilia, it's wrong because it constitutes child porn, but virtual murder is not wrong because there's the content of watching murder is not itself a wrong, right? That's the difference. There's no correlate. So the virtual molestation constitutes a form of child pornography, but virtual murder does not have a correlate of which corresponds to the content being shown as being bad, right? Like watching people get killed is not itself bad, right? But watching child molestation is bad because it constitutes a form of child pornography. So that's the difference, and that's what gets you this distinction, right? So maybe this is, I think for a lot of people in the literature, this is the best argument in the literature. But here is why I think this really does not solve this problem or this dilemma. And I'll try to go through this kind of slowly so we understand what I'm trying to say, because these issues are very difficult, but as you guys are probably being aware, these issues are really important because we are increasingly living in a world where virtual reality is becoming a thing, right? Like it's becoming ubiquitous, and we really need to have an understanding of the ethics of these issues, right? So the main problem with this is that, sure, it gets you the right answer in a way, right? And this is where you have to be judicious with philosophy. Does it actually get you the right answer, but does it get you the right understanding? So on this view, okay, fine. You get your answer. The virtual molestation is wrong because it's constitutes child pornography, while virtual murder is fine. But consider virtual sexual assault in a VR game. On this view, between adults, just virtual assault between adults. On this view or this argument, virtual assault is completely fine. Because again, the content of virtual murder, like the content of virtual assault, as long as it's a representation, it's not real. It's not real sexual assault in the same way that virtual murder is not real murder. It's just that. It's just content. It's like watching sexual assault in a movie, which is not illegal, right? It's not illegal to do that, right? But yet it seems intuitively that says that virtual sexual assault in a game seems morally problematic, right? It seems almost just as problematic as virtual pedophilia. But if that's the case, then this argument does not answer it. So again, there's this really deep issue that is still being discussed. I don't have an answer for this, but again, it's something that I think we need to all start thinking about, is about the ethics of virtual reality and how our actions be governed within this new, increasingly ubiquitous domain. Okay, so again, this was more like a intro into kind of thinking about reality and how it affects our moral judgments. But we're not going to spend any more time on this issue. We're going to move on to other issues of metaphysics. But I hope that this was interesting and engaging. Thank you for listening.